And hi, everybody. I'm Jody Redoran. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Forward. Welcome. I'm going to give people a chance to sign on. We've got a few hundred people signed up. I'm thrilled to bring you this amazing panel today to discuss our hybrid Passover and how this year will be different from last year, which was different from all other years. We've got Marcella White Campbell from Be'chol Lashon, Rabbi Michaelson, Rabbi Elie Kaunfer, I always say his name incorrectly. I'm sorry, Elie, and Al Rosenberg from OneTable. As I said, I'm going to give us a few minutes for people to roll in, but while you're doing that, if you will post in the chat where you're dialing in from, what your connection is to Passover or the Forward or the Jewish world, in other words, why you're here, that would be great. If you're a close relative of one of our panelists, feel free to mention that. And we'll get started in just a second. I want to thank especially Lisa Lepson and also Dina Cooperman and Gabby Brooks from The Forward who helped us put this together, and thank all of our panelists and all of you for joining us. We were just talking amongst ourselves just about how strange it is to be here. I hosted a Zoom. It was one of our very first Zooms after the pandemic took hold, about last year's Passover and how it was going to be totally different than anybody had ever contemplated. And here we are a year later, not in exactly the same space, people getting vaccinated, people contemplating travel and thinking about how to approach this year's Passover, both as different from last year and as different from all those before. So we are gonna get into it. I'm gonna introduce the panel in just a second, but before, just a little bit of tachlis. Thank you for posting in the chat where you're from. It's great to see such a variety. You should feel free to use the chat throughout the conversation to comment on what the panelists are saying, to share a link. But if you have a question that you want me to ask the panel, please don't put it in the chat. Please instead use the Q&A button. It's probably not far from the chat on your screen. And also, one other note about the chat, make sure, as I think you are doing, to chat to all panelists and attendees. Sometimes we get people chatting only to panelists and we feel badly that not the whole audience isn't seeing it. We're going to talk for about an hour. We're going to definitely take your questions and include them. So definitely use the Q&A, and you will get a video of this conversation sent to you by email, along with any of the links that we post in the chat, resources and books and articles and things like that. You'll get all of that in your email. And we would, of course, love it if you would share it with your friends and tell them to join us for our upcoming events as well. We are broadcasting this Zoom live on Facebook on the JD Forward page. You're welcome to share that with your friends right now as we're going. And without further ado, I'm going to now introduce our great panel. So we have with us Rabbi Michaelson. He has, among many other things, been reviewing Haggadot for The Forward since 2009. Every year he gives us the best, the worst, the highlights, the trends, and no, not all of those books behind him are Haggadot. He, in fact, has stopped collecting print ones. Jay is also a columnist for the Daily Beast. He's an editor and teacher for the 10% Happier meditation platform. I'm not sure 10% happier than who. And he's a visiting scholar at the Center for LGBTQ Studies in Religion. He's written 9 books. His latest is Enlightenment by Trial and Error, and he has a bunch of degrees from a bunch of fancy places. We also have not one, but 2 rabbis today. Elie Kaunfer is president and CEO of the Hadar Institute. He's a journalist. He has been a journalist, a banker, and a corporate fraud investigator, which will probably not come up in our Passover discussion. He too has a bunch of fancy degrees and has been part of programs that many of you have probably been part of, Wexner and Dorot. And he's a co-founder of the Kilat Hadar Independent Minyan and wrote the book, Empowered Judaism, What Independent Minyanim Can Teach Us About Building Vibrant Jewish Communities. Lately, one of the things Elie has been doing is leading a 15-minute daily Haggadah study every morning from 7:45. And I think he's going to post for us in the chat the link to how you could sign up to join him in the next, I assume it's going for the next week. And Elie has been named not once, but multiple times to Newsweek's list of the top 50 rabbis in America. We also have Al Rosenberg, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at OneTable, an organization that's designed to help millennials develop Shabbat dinner habits and new rituals. Before OneTable, Al was head of marketing at a liberal arts college, a law firm, and an indie publishing house. They're a board member emeritus, at Michigan, Chicago, and they are calling in from Skokie, Illinois, although originally from Miami. Al also says that they read at least 2 books a week with tea in hand. So that sounds relaxing and maybe goes with the 10% happier of Jay. And finally, we have Marcella White Campbell, who's joining us from San Francisco. She is the executive director of Be'chol Lashon, which is an organization that has advocated for the diversity of the Jewish people for more than 20 years. Before, Marcella's been at Be'chol Lashon for a while. She was just elevated to the top job. And before that, she was a branding and storytelling consultant. And before that, she was also a copywriter. Also with the fancy degrees, BA, MA, all this good stuff, and lots of smart ideas to share with us. So, as I said, I'm thrilled to see you guys all chatting. We are going to start. I just have been thinking a lot about last year, and I assume everyone else has been too. So I'm going to ask you each to start with just a quick lightning round to tell us a bit about how your Passover ended up last year. It was kind of this unprecedented, anticipated, much discussed. I'd love to hear one specific thing that was an unexpected surprise or upside of whatever seders you did or other rituals, and one thing that kind of sucked. Why don't we start with you, Marcella?
Well, I would say what was surprising to me is because we were kind of in our little cocoon on Zoom at home, it was probably the first time in maybe 10 years that I actually read the words in the Haggadah instead of, running around looking for finger bowls of salt water or putting out a fire or, something along those lines. And that was actually really inspiring to go, oh yes, these stories are very valuable. And I, felt very uplifted by the end of that. I would say probably like many people, we're used to having our big family. We have a multi-generational, multiracial, multi-religion Jewish family, and Passover among everyone is actually our biggest holiday, bigger than Thanksgiving. So it really felt kind of like a punch to the gut, not to have everybody all together there, and instead to be, on that Zoom delay where we're all trying to sing together, and it just creates that awful wall of sound.
Jay, why don't you go next?
My Passover last year mostly sucked. I think it was just tough. It was that period where all of us were struggling with what the pandemic was going to look like in our lives. I think, we also didn't really know how to deal with my then 2-year-old daughter on Zoom. We had this naive idea that she might actually like Zoom in some way, and that wasn't true. So we tried to sort of make it kid-centric, and that wasn't the right strategy for that particular configuration. It was new to her and weird for other people. It just wasn't, it was challenging. But I did actually, the best thing that came out of it actually is a subject of a piece that'll be in the forward in the next few days, which was we couldn't observe with the kind of strictness that I usually did. I grew up in the conservative movement, but like a lot of conservative Jews, was much more strict on Passover than the rest of the year. And so whether it was, getting rid of every last grain of cereal or only shopping for, hechshered butter or whatever, I was pretty strict, even long after I stopped being that strict in the rest of my life in terms of observance. And last year I just couldn't. And not only did I find out that it was okay, that, I wasn't like alienated from my religious tradition, it was actually a much lighter, more centered observance than I'd had in recent years.
So does that mean, what is that going to mean for this year's strictness?
So I'm now there's this word, I'm a scholar, I have a degree in religious studies. There's this word called antinomianism, which is that it's a positive religious duty to break religious law. And that's where I'm at this year. I'm trying really hard not to go back to my kind of obsessive compulsive cleaning ways. We're not getting rid of every single bit of food that we don't consume. We're not requiring everything to be kosher certified. So I'm doing my best to break some of those practices that seemed like really bad habits for me, not commenting on anyone else's observance, obviously. And it's an interesting journey to try to, now that I don't have to be a little bit looser, trying to push myself in a direction that's less guilt oriented and more joy and spirituality and family oriented.
Thank
I
you.
totally
And I think,
resonated with Marcella's comment about the salt water dishes and like fretting over
Yeah.
like the various kitchen disasters, because I'm sort of the main cook person in my family. And yeah, it was kind of a treat to not have the logistics be in the foreground.
great. Dave, I see that David Fink has posted in the chat kind of his answer to this, and I would encourage others to do the same. And I'm going to share right now a link to a story we did last year right after Passover. We just asked readers how it went, and we did get a surprising level of better than I thought kind of things, and a lot of really lovely specific insights. So Al, tell us about your Passover last year.
Sure. I think that the best part of my Passover was I took a virtual matzah making class with Liz Alpern, the co-founder of the Gefilteria, and really dug into the food part of Passover. Normally, I am also the host. A lot of what you all have said so far really deeply resonates with me. I allow that to take over my identity and to take over my Passover experience so that it becomes less about freedom and more about making sure that everyone has what they need in that moment. So definitely last year, being able to fixate on this one piece, making sure that we had matzah that we could eat and that it was done the right way, helped me let go of a lot of the other pieces. I would say the part that was the
You
hardest.
made homemade matzah?
Oh my God, yes. And it's so easy. It's so much easier than anyone thinks it is.
And is it good?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's matzah, so it's as good as.
Are you doing it again?
Yes, 100%. We're not even buying matzah. I'm just making matzah. So,
wow.
Really delightful. Is it fully kosher? No, but that's okay for us. So I'm gonna move forward with that. I put salt on it. It ruins the whole thing, but it makes it more edible. I think the hardest part for us, for my partner and I, the communities we're a part of, the queer and trans communities, were some of the earliest communities to be so Zoom fatigued that they were just not interested in online anything. And so we ended up, the year prior, I'd hosted 2 nights in a row and had a collective 60 people at my home. And suddenly I wasn't going to see any of those people. So I think that was really tricky and something that we're trying to figure out moving forward.
Elie, how about you? Did you make some homemade matzah? Oh, you're on mute.
I'm just putting in the chat the when the New York Times covered a homemade matzah event that we did a little while ago. No, I'm not eating homemade matzah. The trauma from last year for me stems from two aspects. One, I was living in New York City, and of course, shopping it was both a blessing to have a Passover store where everything in the store is kosher, and so you just walk in and grab anything you want off the shelf. And also, it felt like an extremely risky, like all of a sudden you're crushed in with other people, and at the time you couldn't touch anything without freaking out. So it was a very, very stressful Pesach shopping experience. And yet we ended up having Seder together. I think the other scary thing for us was we didn't do a Zoom Seder, and we were running Seder for the first time ever with our nuclear family, which was me, my wife, and our 3 kids who were 13, at the time were 12, 9, and 5. And we thought it was going to be terrible, and so did they. And I think the silver lining was it actually wasn't so terrible. The kids actually stepped up and did some things. They took some ownership, and the adults also stood up and took some ownership. Normally, it's my dad who's running the Seder, and so I've done nothing for the Seder for my whole life. But this was an opportunity, I guess, to step in and do something proactive.
So let's turn to this year and how, it's so interesting because what we were talking earlier also about how with those who do 2 Seders, it's always a little bit challenging of how do you even differentiate them from each other. And of course it is, so much of this is about doing the same thing every year, but there's also a lot of efforts. And obviously Jay's been studying all these haggadot that make this effort to modify, change, grow the Seder. And I guess I'm interested in how you all are thinking about, after this particularly intense, history-making, polarizing, challenging year, which is also a year where I think a lot of us just learn new things about ourselves and our priorities. How are we supposed to come to the Passover table? What should we bring with us that's new, or how are you thinking about it? And I don't know who wants to go first, but we can just jump around. Anyone?
Sure.
I know, Al, that your group is doing a lot of things to help other people with this question. So maybe you want to talk about what you're seeing there.
Sure. Yeah, we're hearing from a lot of participants. My work is really based around helping young adults usually connect to Shabbat ritual every week. And we also take a detour and do Passover for many good reasons. And a lot of what we're hearing is, I think Black and brown Jews have always been doing the work, have always been creating the resources, and now it's just become even more unacceptable to not be listening to their voices and centering their voices. And so a lot of what we've seen from our participants over the last year is turning to the communities they're a part of and saying, okay, how can you point me to those resources? I'm not bringing them at my table. I was just using the Maxwell House Haggadah. How do I make sure that that's not what I can keep doing and actually bring in something that's meaningful, that can create not just the discussion at the table, but a clear direction towards what are the actions post-Passover or during Passover. So a lot of that has been really invigorating work over the last year. And I would say that for this year, there's also this piece of people being absolutely exhausted, where they don't want to have to sit down and recreate everything. And, even in the question about the second night, what if the second night was just saying, that's enough, we did the first night and let's take a nap on the second night because we're all really tired and need to recharge. And we're seeing both things, people who are ready to get out there and push harder for equity and justice, and people who are also like, great, I want to do that. And I also need to recharge myself and make sure that I'm ready for another year of it.
Marcella, you talked about in your first remarks about, your big multiracial, multidimensional family that includes Jews and non-Jews. And of course, one of the things historically around Passover has been that it's the most celebrated Jewish ritual or holiday and has often included non-Jews, and the ways that the themes of Passover can resonate with other social justice concerns. And I'd love you to talk about how you're thinking about that this year in particular.
Yeah, one of the things that is really important to me about the work that we do is we really try to lean into the idea that Jews of color have a voice that needs to be heard and that needs to be shared. And, my background is marketing and storytelling. So that's something I think about a lot, like narratives. And I get so excited when I see the many different haggadot that I see among, the creative people I know, Jews of color that I know, the ways in which they use the story of the Jewish people to also tell their own story, to also put themselves into that story. And, as an African-American, as well as a Jew, I come from a storytelling tradition. And one of the things that was so incredible to me, we just lost my grandfather, who is not Jewish. And he used to preside at our seders, even though he was not Jewish, and just, be part of this big story. And he related so much to this big story about survival because, I tell my kids that they come from two surviving people. And so it's always been really energizing for me to see those narratives come together at Passover. And I take a lot of solace in that. And I definitely always leave strengthened and kind of ready to go forward because we're talking about this theme of survival. We're talking about this theme of passing this, passion to our kids. So I will miss that. I will miss that opportunity to get together and share our story. But I do think that there's an opportunity with Haggadot for people to share their stories with other people and have other people, take pieces of those into their seders. I really love that people do that. That, sometimes when we create supplements, people will take our supplement that maybe talks about the stories of Jews of color and mix it with, the Maxwell House, Haggadah, and just make this mishmash that's part of this evolving Jewish story.
So let's get into Haggadot. Jay, one of the things you wrote about in your current version of the Haggadot review of Haggadot for the forward was actually about how easy it has now become online to mix and match, as Marcella was just talking about. Can you talk to us about, I guess, let's start with why and how you became a person who reads every Haggadah and knows, reviews them and has this much interest. Why there are so many Haggadot and what are the newest best, or what did you see emerge this year that struck you as reflecting maybe the momentousness of the year or the changes that are going on in our society? And I'm going to share in the chat the link to your great article.
Great, thanks. I think so. I started on this because somebody, I think some arts editor at the Forward made me do it, but I kept doing it year after year, reviewing these haggadahs, because for me, the DIY nature and the personalized nature of the Seder ritual is like part of my favorite parts of Judaism. And, just like both Al and Marcella were saying, like there's ways to, the Seder comes alive when it becomes translated into our lived experience and into the lived experiences of others that we can learn from. And so this is like, it's such a beautiful way to do that. Funny, I was noticing my like body clench up every time someone said Maxwell House, because I feel so sad that there's some large number of American Seders that are still using an uncommentaried Haggadah, whether it's Maxwell House or one of the other ones. Because the text is weird, it's opaque, some of it's problematic, some might even say offensive. And the whole point of this ritual is to have this kind of conversation and this teaching moment and learning and re-experiencing. Like you're meant to really re-experience this liberation, this moving from a place of oppression into liberation. And so to just read through it feels like sort of a tragedy, right? Because it doesn't do that. The text doesn't do that on its own. It needs to be brought into our experience. One of the haggadahs that I reviewed this year was actually written toward the end of World War II by a Moroccan Jew who retold the Seder story as like, so Pharaoh is Hitler, and these people are the allies, and these people are he just recast the entire Passover story in his experience. And this was in 1944, written in 1944. The publisher wisely called it the Hitler Haggadah, which is a great way to sell books on Amazon.
I think we called it that in our headline too.
Yeah, great. So it's a smart marketing move, but that's just like a model, right, for us, a model and it goes way back, well beyond 1944, people doing that. So I just find it really inspiring. I'll just again kind of steal Elie's line, because I've known him for 20 years, that like people, there's a kind of empowerment that happens, I guess, because it's by family, and people feel empowered to create a ritual space for themselves. And I think that's what all of Judaism should look like, but it definitely does on these 1 or 2 nights a year.
So you're obviously a person who's very discriminating about what books you own, given your Zoom background. But I'm interested. So if you're a guy who voraciously consumes multiple Haggadot and now has a gig reviewing them, how do you then figure out which Haggadot to use at your Seder?
So we've used this online resource, haggadot.com, for the last few years, where you can really mix and match from different sources. And I love bringing in, just like lots of different perspectives. My sister actually put together a Haggadah in memory of my mom, drawing on another favorite Haggadah of mine, Rachel Barenblatt's The Velveteen Haggadah, and then adding her own stuff to it. So we sort of used that. This year, we're also going to use Taya Scher's Haggadah, which is like a tarot deck Haggadah, because I'm a weird spiritual meditating Jew and I love that kind of stuff. And we'll be using some of the social justice resources from the Trua Haggadah, which this year has a lot of really good stuff on migration, on racial justice, and a lot of issues of very real time oppression, not just like what may have happened in Egypt, in the mythic past, but actual oppression actually happening now, and bringing that into our consciousness. So we do sort of mix and match, but we also I've never had the problem of the 2 Seders seeming different, because I always have one with my family of origin and then one with my chosen family, which for me is my queer family here in Brooklyn. And so we've had a queer Seder every year for the last 15 or so, where we don't have Haggadahs. People get to different parts based on the things and create all kinds of stuff. And that was missing that last year was really tough. It was tough to miss that family connection. So for me, it's just this great opportunity to not have the one best Haggadah in the world, but have all of these different various voices and options that are accessible.
And it seems like the mix and match on haggadot.com, if I understand it correctly, will also solve the problem that we've all had when we've tried to use multiple haggadahs and nobody's on the same page.
We're now on page 73 in the Choose Your Own Adventure Haggadah, but 14 in the Be'chol Lashon supplement. So
obviously, Rabbi Michaelson has been to rabbinical school where they clearly have a course in how to say that in that voice.
I once made a sheet, like a little printout of the 12 different Haggadahs that we were using and a matrix of what page. We don't do that anymore.
I'm sure that worked beautifully. Elie, I'm going to turn to you because you have been spending, I'm not sure exactly how many weeks, but some amount of time every morning really digging into the original text or the core text of the Haggadah, right? So tell us a little bit about, I mean, you're somebody who's been to, I'm sure, something like 100 seders in your life, and probably studied the Haggadah before, but what are you learning anew in this class?
Yeah, so we're just taking the telling section of the Haggadah, the Magid section, which is the same word as Haggadah, and trying to understand it because, as Jay said, there's a lot of texts in there, and they don't really make sense if you just read them straight through. So we're just spending some time unpacking them and sort of doing our own commentary. I would say that this is a challenge that I'm putting out for me and sharing with all of you in terms of choosing a Haggadah. You know, in some ways, the Haggadah is like a plan B to a plan A. The plan A is you should ask questions and talk about them. In other words, the Mishnah, the original sort of roadmap to the Haggadah says, when you pour the second cup, which is the moment when you're about to start telling the story, it says, V'kana ben shoel et aviv, like here's where the child asks the parent. And if the child isn't able to ask the parent, then you say manishtana and you sort of run through all that stuff. But what would it take to sort of foster spontaneous Q&A back and forth where you're not announcing pages because there are no pages, it's just the text of our own questions. And I think as an educator, my wife is an educator for kids, like think about how you would design that atmosphere, I think is sort of like an interesting challenge to take on. And certainly I think the original spirit of the Haggadah.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about what Marcella said about being a storyteller and about this being an experience of telling the story, which of course resonates with me as a storyteller too. And I'm just thinking the Seder is at once, so it's at least three things. It's, first of all, order, right? It's a list of rituals that you're going to go through in this order. It is this idea that you're supposed to spark questions and have this discussion and give answers. And it is this telling of a story in which we're meant to put ourselves in the story. Maybe there are 6 other things that it is that the rabbis will correct me on, but I would love for the rest of you to jump in and talk about it. I mean, I'm sort of, we have, maybe all of Judaism is also a mix of those things, but it feels interesting that this one dinner, this night, is meant to be all those things at the same time. Are there the storytelling? Obviously, I guess reading the Torah over the year is also telling a big story, but let's talk about the storytelling aspect a little bit. How do we access that, and why is that so core to this holiday and to our people? Al, you're nodding. You get to go.
Oh, great.
Nodding
sure.
on Zoom is like, you got to get called on.
Yes, volunteering myself. Yes. Listen, I'm biased and think that Shabbat is really, if I were going to pick a holiday, it would be Shabbat. But I will say that there's so many similarities, especially around the storytelling piece for Passover and Shabbat, that it's a natural translation for me, right? And for my participants who are mostly young adults, although last year, and I'll put this in the chat, we launched herefor.com, which is an online resource to help anyone anywhere do a virtual Seder. And we relaunched it for high holidays. And it asked that question of, who are you bringing to your table? What story are you trying to tell? And in a lot of the conversations we've had with participants over the year, that varies so widely. We hear from people who are actually really investing in themselves right now. They're doing solo Shabbat practice. They're going to do Passover alone. And it's this chance for them to really double down on the learning aspect and the ritual aspect, and talk about the story of self through the ritual, which I think is not something that Judaism gives a lot of space for. We do a lot of communal activity without saying, here's what you can do if you're totally isolated, here's what you can do if you're not near a community. So really watching people teach themselves how to do that has been incredibly powerful for me and for my team, and learning how to create more resources to enable people to do that. And I think overall, the storytelling piece, I mean, what you were just saying about a haggadah being sort of the backup, I think is so beautiful. And I think that that's really a goal that I would like to set for myself and challenge my participants with, because each of them comes with their own unique identity, their own unique connection to Judaism. And what would it look like if we centered that in a lot of this conversation to really learn about and from each other, and how that would shift this conversation, how this would shift all Jewish conversations if we actually really dug deep into who are we and why are we here in this tradition together. So I think that was really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
And I love what you just said about what story are we trying to tell. And I'm really interested what the other panelists say about what story are we telling? What story are we telling at Passover? Marcella, I'm looking at you.
I really do. I'm a very, in some ways, despite storytelling, I'm a very literal person, and I sometimes see it as a blueprint, you know, for survival and for how to survive as a people. And actually, I really lean into the questions when we are actually telling this story, because, you know, I'm a parent. My kids are very old now, but I really think there are times when your kids catch you off guard with a question and you actually come up with a very interesting story or very interesting way to explain, you know, what this concept. And so when I do look at other Haggadot, I like to see how they handle the questions, because I really think that that's where the story starts, because we're supposed to be talking to our children, or at least I'm talking to my children, and we lean into these questions and we think, you know, how do I answer you? Where do I want you to go with this? I always love that the questions actually, we look at the different types of children, the different types of possible perspectives, which is so creative because you're looking ahead. You're thinking people are different, children are different. Questions will change over time. How do we keep this relevant for us? I really think that comes back to the questions. I talk a lot about questions because people often, when they're trying to reach out to Jews of color to make them feel welcome, they ask a lot of questions. You know, they ask, where are you from? What's your Jewish journey? All these things and what they're kind of trying to get at is, you know, are you Jewish? Do you belong here? Why are you here? What's going on? And teaching what the right questions to ask are actually ends up being one of the most important skills, knowing what question to ask, knowing when to ask. And that's something we're really going to be leaning into at our Seder, I think, this year, looking at the questions and going, are these the right questions? What might better questions be? Are we not asking everything we could be asking right now?
That's so good. I love that. And we have Alan Altschul, one of the audience members, chatted just to the panelists. I'm going to share it about the questions. And he said every year he looks forward to hearing the family patriarch do the 4 questions in Yiddish with theatrical and exaggerated Yiddish inflections. This year, his family's starting a new tradition of adding a 5th question at the Seder. And the 5th question will be a Passover riddle or joke. However, he's saying the 5th question could also be something related to freedom or slavery. I think, as Marcella just said, you know, the tradition of asking questions, asking good questions, never stopping asking questions is such a Jewish thing. Happens to also be a big journalistic thing, so it works well for me. But I think I've always tried to use this 5th question structure to encourage people to ask more questions. It doesn't always work. There's this push-pull between, right? I mean, Elie was talking about this before. It's like, we want to ask questions and have discussion. What does this bring up for you? And then it's like, but we got to get through this stuff and we all are hungry and we want dinner. So I feel like there's this tension that we're all trying to navigate.
So I'd love to kind of respond to that. I want to put in a plug for Karpas, which is meant to not just be like a little dangling thing of parsley, but actual appetizers. So we do like we put on like salads, we put on like a bunch of vegetables, like no matzah or like ready type things, but like, so I want to like suggest that as a way of like, I hate when like I get hangry really quickly. So I don't
Well, I had this at some Seder, and I've been trying to convince my family about it for a long time. So I'm going to have Lisa send the recording to my father. So thank you, Jay.
Toss it up,
a
like
rabbinic
lots
voice
of
of that.
vegetables, lots of dips. But what I was just hearing kind of what we were just talking about a moment ago about the questions we're asking and not asking. And for me, actually, I just saw someone post in the chat a little while ago of like, I wish, where you're talking earlier about what would you like to bring forward from pandemic Passover, and someone put maybe half jokingly, I'd like to be able to mute my relatives the way that I did last year. And that was definitely true for me. I mean, I've been to some toxic seders, right? With like, not just my family of origin, but like with their friends, whether it's the literal racist uncle who's literally an uncle and is literally racist, or whether it's just like, they can be really challenging and not safe. Like they can be really uncomfortable spaces. And for me, I think one of the great learnings for me of Passover is like this whole narrative could be read as like every Jewish holiday, right? They tried to kill us, they didn't, let's eat, right? And like this is something that happened to us, and so this is about us, like Jewish particularism, like this is our history, we're the most oppressed, like this and that. And like that is, I guess, one way to read this narrative. But for me, obviously, well, I know obviously, but for me, the deeper resonance is to see this as a universal story that through a Jewish lens, right? So here's our experience of marginalization, slavery, oppression, othering, being a foreigner, and then some kind of liberation happens, and then the work that comes after that. That for me is a narrative that is so alive this year. So for a lot of Americans who, maybe racial justice was like one of the things that they thought about, but now is like much more in the center of a lot of people's consciousness than maybe it had been a year ago or something like that. Like this is a real opportunity to make this narrative not like another thing that like happened to us. Fun fact, by the way, my daughter, who's now 3, thinks that Haman is the one who enslaved the Jews and won't let the people go. So it's just like whichever villain it is, that like
Whatever.
I love that she's confused. I think that's really telling. But
maybe she'll just burst out spontaneously booing in the middle of the Seder.
That would be great. So
I
think that's a real opportunity to make this a Seder about liberation and not and expand that conversation.
I'm so glad you brought us to that, because I think it's really clear that as I said earlier, the Seder has been the most celebrated Jewish ritual, and also celebrated including by many non-Jews or Jew adjacent people or whatever. And there's also this whole parallel universe of the feminist Seder or the refugee Seder, often done separately from Seder night. And then, as you said, many Jews integrate and strive to talk about stories other than the Exodus from Egypt through this ritual. And I am interested in how all of you balance the questions that Jay raised of like, how do what role the particular Jewish story of Exodus from Egypt plays, and also the structured ritual versus the more universal thematic stories or themes and discussions, including the ones that are happening every day in our lives right now. What's the right way to balance those things?
I just wanted to jump in on the arc of the story that we tell, and I really feel like if you could boil it down, it's Marcella. I loved your. We don't know which question needs to be asked, and in some ways that's the instruction. It just says ask a question. Here's where the child asks a question, not here's where the child asks this question that I've pre-scripted for you. So I feel like part of it is like you're encouraging us to ask a question that is new, that is different. And then the other part of telling the story is, and this gets to the universal or particular, the mission just says, Matchil b'genut u'misayim b'shvach. Start with degradation and finish with praise. I mean, is there any more sort of universal arc that you could construct than that? It's very general. And I think part of the reason the Haggadah is very choppy is because it's trying to answer that arc of a story in different ways. We started as slaves, now we're free. We started as idol worshipers, now we've come to see the true God. And you can run that on a geographic. We started in exile, next year we'll be in the promised land. There's different ways to run that story of starting in degradation, moving to praise. Of course, the Haggadah, the praise in the Haggadah is probably the Hallel, the singing that is literally like I'm singing praises to God. And one of the most moving things for me in this past year, thinking about Hallel on a universal spectrum, was in the funeral for George Floyd, one of the pastors gave in the eulogy quoted the psalm from Hallel that says, "Even masu abonim haita l'rosh pina." I didn't quote it in Hebrew, but the stone that was rejected became the cornerstone, and that was his metaphor for George Floyd, who, you know, he was attributing you know, the start of a movement, or really the pushing forward of a movement. And I just thought, when I heard that quotation, obviously in a religious tradition that also values the book of Psalms, but when I heard that, I was like, that is the intention that I want to bring to my Hallel, you know, on Seder night, of, you know, who are the rejected stones that will become the cornerstone, and just thinking about that in a broader way.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. And thinking about that, and thinking about, Jody, your question, and what you brought up, Marcella, about, you know, how do we know the right question to ask, or the right way to ask these questions? You know, I am a person without children, and I deal with a lot of adults without children. And so the question of like having the kid and ask the question or tell the story or whatever, how can I give myself permission, and how can other adults give themselves permissions to use the Seder as practice for the rest of the year, of learning how to ask those questions, of being childlike in that moment, and being willing to move from degradation to liberation to education to whatever it is, and saying like, I don't know the right way to do this. I'm still learning. There is always more opportunity to learn, and like, to your point of, if you can reinvest in each piece of the Seder and say, great, this is what this has meant for me this year. This is what I'm bringing to it this year. I think that is really powerful. It doesn't have to be the same as every year before. The tradition can be that we're sitting down together, we're doing the Seder, but it can be refreshed with what is realistic for us now? What do we still need to learn? What have I learned over this last year, but I know that I still need to go further? And I think that's what's coming up for me a lot in that balance, is how do I balance the tradition with what I know I still need to invest in, and the time I need to spend in other places.
Marcella?
Mostly I was nodding because I completely agree. I think that's really lovely. But what I've also just been really delighting in, and I think I might have touched on it before, is just the extent to which the Haggadah can be a living thing. That it's not, that you shouldn't just be sitting at your Passover table just reading a script and going on with your life. It's supposed to touch you. It's supposed to energize you. It's supposed to be relevant to what you're doing right now. And part of what I love about us continuing to add supplements and to make, you know, bring poems into it and bring new traditions into it is just the sense of ownership that you should have. You should feel that it is okay to make your practice, you know, relevant to you. And it's so empowering, I think, for people when they realize that, when they understand that this is your Jewish. You can do your Jewish however you need to do your Jewish, but it is possible to make it relevant to what you need right now.
Yeah, I love that. I'm thinking about, it's interesting, just thinking about in normal life, right? If you ask the same questions over and over again and expect to get a different answer, that you're being a fool, right? Like you need to keep asking different questions, even if you, or ask the same question a different way. So it's interesting. I mean, it's like so obviously limiting to just kind of recite these questions, you know, with some expectation that there'll be like revelation of new information. But I was also thinking, when Elie was talking about this before, like, so if we could actually accomplish a thing where you would just throw it open and be like, so who's got a question? And that the idea of the Seder is that the story is so universal that no matter what question gets asked, the answer is somewhere in this story. So it's sort of, instead of asking the same questions every year, we would ask whatever question, but there'd be a path back to the kind of essential arc that Elie was talking about. That feels like the ideal Seder. I don't know if we can achieve it, but I'm going to take that to mine.
You can also do a little prep with that, right? I mean, you can let the folks know who are coming, whether it's a Zoom Seder or an in-person, like, hey, think of a question that you'd like to ask the other participants or what's going on for them. I've also, over the years, just given a little of a prompt question, like what is there some liberation that you experienced over this past year, or that you're praying for, that you're hoping for, that you're aware isn't present, that you're yearning for? To put it a little bit, give them a little bit of a prompt, something to work with. That's worked well for me.
Are other people on that? How do you get people to ask good questions? Or I've definitely done that and asked, to try to make the Mitzrayim or the personal or the liberation personal. But what are you, Elie, you're smiling, so you got something, right?
My uncle that I think Jay interned for, he would put little questions on a strip of paper underneath everyone's plate. And so if you didn't have a question of your own, you could just pull out the question. But you could sort of take that idea. There's something nice about having a tactile.
It's like a built-in cheat sheet. I love that.
Yeah. And so there was this old tradition that the way you would inspire questions in the Talmud is they would take away the table. This is when everybody had sort of like a TV dinner tray table, so you could actually remove it. But that's sort of like a similar thing. Like you pick up the plate, here's a question. And it could be, someone else writes the question for you. Maybe you bring your own question, you put it under there. Maybe you write a question, but you give it to your friend, put it under their plate. You can play around with it.
Cool idea. And just the process of hearing other questions also usually prompts questions, right? So that's a good tactic.
Yeah, I also, Lisa in the chat wrote this piece about some people need the Haggadah as the structure, right? That they're not ready to ask their own question. Elie, to what you're saying of having something that they can use to lean on a crutch to say like, okay, well, this is my question, then it's been given to me. I think that's powerful too, especially tied to what I said earlier about people being exhausted. How many people are ready to come into the Seder and be like, oh yes, I'm feeling very creative right now. Here are all of my questions. I think some of us do need a little more structure. And so I like the idea, even if it's like a fishbowl style where you all put your questions in the middle and some of them have been pre-written, or even if it's something as simple as like starting with very small questions so that it doesn't feel so enormous when you have to ask the big question of liberation, right? Like, how do you start smaller than that and work up to it?
Well, one participant just put in the custom of putting an orange on the Seder plate. And that reminded me that, the Seder, the way it's sort of staged is very kinesthetic and has a lot of objects. So there's the orange, which has its own complicated history of where that actually came from, but is generally a feminist conversation starter. There's a lot of different objects that people can put on the table, and then that is the question, like what is this banana doing on the, and there is a banana. The banana one I think was either free trade or migration, or I forget exactly which issue. But.
So that I was really thrilled to see Missy Lee post that. Although I want to remind you that if you want to comment to the whole audience, make sure you do panelists and attendees. But I was just about to go to the orange on the Seder plate. So and for those of you who read my newsletter, this is going to be a little advance of what you're going to get tomorrow. But the original origin of putting the orange on the Seder plate had to do with lesbians being discriminated against. It was then misunderstood as being about female rabbis, but feminists and queer people have continued to put the orange on the Seder plate, and I have been doing it for many years myself. And one of my thoughts about it was both as a representation of those issues, but also as a question prompt. What's that doing here? It seems so essential to the idea of Passover to prompt questions. And then over the years, I have started to think about it in slightly a different way, because the idea is, a female rabbi or a lesbian Jew is as bizarre as an orange on a Seder plate. And the idea that, for my own kids, a lesbian cantor, which is what we have, or a female rabbi is just so what they know. They wouldn't imagine that would ever have been something that you couldn't imagine. So for me, the orange on the Seder plate has now become a symbol of the fact that we don't know what the next generation will take for granted, or what we don't know what will seem other or strange, or how Judaism will change. And I guess what I've been reflecting on, sorry for the long wind up, but I've been reflecting a lot about how that is the perfect metaphor for this year, because this year we were all forced quickly to make changes in how we do Jewish, or how we do our organizations, or how we do family, in ways that we didn't know existed in some cases, or we didn't know we could do or would work or would integrate with this older tradition. And things have really changed quite a bit. I've been doing a lot of thinking about which of those changes we really want to keep with us, which of those changes were really about growth and innovation and kind of focusing on what the essence of things are. But so now, as I'm planning on keeping my orange on the Seder plate to continue that metaphor of change becoming norm. But I'm really trying to think about what is the right other thing to add to your Seder plate or your Seder table this year to kind of represent this year, and what we could do to sort of acknowledge that huge growth and change and challenge that we've all kind of been through. And I'm interested in if any of you have any creative ideas of how to do that, or how to, again, just connect the ritual to the day-to-day experience that we're all living through.
I'll jump in around one thing that I want to carry over from last year. I remember last year feeling so jarred by the statement that we open up the Magid section when we say, all who are hungry, come and eat. Kol dichvin yete v'yechol, which even in normal times seems like a false invitation. Like, really? Or, am I really inviting people in? But last year, it was like illegal to invite people in. And there is an interesting moment in Jewish history where a commentator from about 1,000 years ago says about that line, well, they used to actually invite people in, and they would open their doors and people would actually show up. But now we live in a world in which that's not possible. So how do you feed the hungry? You got to do it in advance. Like, you have to take on the responsibility to feed people before the night of the Seder. And I feel like, just doubling down the efforts that we can do to associate, leading into Pesach with making sure that everybody who is hungry has something to eat, as an aspirational goal. That's something that I would like to bring forward in a more intense way this year that I took from last year.
I remember when we were living in Jerusalem, I thought when we opened the door, someone might actually be there, like looking for a Seder, in a way that you don't really get in America. And then I remember also last year, one of the most moving parts of the whole year was those videos of everybody saying the 4 questions in Israel out on their porches, their mirpesets. And there are these different ways in which that collective communal thing has become more clear this year, there's also more and more division about how different classes of people have experienced the pandemic, but there is this collective responsibility in a way that I think is new or newly understood.
I think if I could jump in, I think I'm resonating a little bit with what Al said earlier, that a lot of people are needing some self-care and some support and healing. There's 5 billion traumatized people on this planet right now. And, that vulnerability is something that if we're in a safe enough space with people who we can trust and, love, that can be explored in the Seder, that we're wounded in a pretty intense way, like as individuals, as a society, as groups in a society. And we can bring that. I think the Passover narrative is profound in that way and can hold that. And the Seder container can hold that if we're feeling, comfortable enough to bring and safe enough to bring that vulnerability to the Seder. Like, I don't think, someone asked in the chat again of is COVID slavery. I don't know about that analogy, for me personally, but it's certainly the notion that, whether we've been vaccinated yet or not, or it's on the horizon or whatever, the notion that we can embody the dream of freedom, for me, could lead to a lot of solidarity, right? For me, the point of imagining what it might have been like to be enslaved in Egypt 3,000 years ago isn't just imagination. It's to stimulate solidarity with people who are oppressed now, right? And redouble that, and really embody it, and literally embody it. We're eating maror, we're having this kinesthetic embodied experience of bitterness, not to just take a trip and have something, but to really commit the ethical monotheism to the ethical part, and to justice. And likewise here, for those of us, however we're observing the Seder this year, and it is so bizarre that it's on this cusp where for some people it might be safe to gather and for others not, and it's this very awkward in between stage for these next several months.
We're in the walk.
What's that? I'm sorry?
In the walk across the sea. It's like we're in the transition.
That's right. And I think that's an opportunity for us to really inhabit with compassion what suffering might really feel like for people who are not as privileged and fortunate as I am.
Yeah, and I think if this is, I love all that. And I think if we're taking the Seder as practice for the rest of the year until the next one, when we talk about liberation again, how are we and tied to self-care, how are we also, what are we asking of ourselves? And when it comes to liberation, if we want to prepare for the Seder in a certain way, if we want to feed the hungry before the Seder, what happens after all of that? How are we taking care of ourselves so that what we commit to in this one night of talking about freedom actually carries into the next few months, and that we can turn back to this and say, like, this is what I committed to. This is what I actually learned about in this night. These are the questions I asked myself. Let's carry them into the next 12 months as things shift and open.
That's great. Passover, of course, being the original New Year, so we can think of it that way too. So we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to just do give everyone one last word, and you can really pick up on anything that you've been talking about, although I'll just give you a last prompt, which is to say, maybe we close with something we're looking forward to about this Passover. And I feel like this for a Jewish gathering about Passover, we've been quite light on food. So if you want to talk about something that a food memory or something that you cook or are looking forward to eating or something that would be great. But I'm just going to open it up. We'll go Marcella, Al, Elie, and Jay. We'll do it in that order, giving Jay the last word.
Well, I will say that we are a very greedy family, and normally I would jump at the opportunity to talk about food and all of the things we cannot wait to taste at the table. But I really want to think a little bit about when we say, you were a stranger in a strange land, welcome the stranger, because it often becomes an opportunity to talk about racial justice, to talk about equality, to talk about being welcoming to, the strangers all of us around us. But it's really important to remember that there are many, many people who are within the Jewish community who do not feel welcome, and they are not strangers. So one commitment that we should be making is thinking about that. Do the people who are already in our community feel like they belong? And what can we commit to in the coming year to change that? A year from now, when you can open up your doors and you can welcome people in, who's going to be sitting at your table next Passover? I think it's an important thing to think about.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, yes to all of that, Marcella, absolutely. And I think for us, we're having people over who have quarantined and are joining us, and a lot of what we've planned for the evening, we're having 2 people who have quarantined and coming over, and a lot of what we've planned is talking about queer community and what that looks like, because so much of queer community is only replicable right now in person. And so now as we enter another year where it's uncertain when we'll be able to gather, how do we make sure that we're showing up, we're entering Jewish spaces with respect, and also finding Jewish spaces that center the queer voice. So thinking a lot about that through our Passover Seder.
Jump on the food prompt, but with matzah, just going super traditional on that. I think for me, matzah relates to the moment that we're in, because matzah has this double meaning. On the one hand, it's the bread that we ate as slaves in Egypt. Who would ever want to eat that again? You only eat that as a slave. And on the other hand, it's the bread that we ate in the moment of liberation. And I think that's a very powerful symbol, because it is actually both ends of that arc of degradation and praise. And for COVID, so many of us has been just the absolute worst, horrible plague. I mean, my uncle died. It's a horrible thing that we're all suffering in our own ways around. And at the same time, there are some opportunities that we're trying to identify. And just like the matzah, I hope we'll find that liberation aspect this year.
Thank you.
Yeah, a couple of folks have said in the chat too. I mean, it's funny, like what do we symbolize? What's the orange on the Seder plate for the pandemic? Like what's the symbol? And it's funny that for me, it's like the whole thing is the symbol. Again, whether we're gathering in person, maybe for the first time, in a while, or whether we're still not gathering in person. I mean, that it's I think we're so still in it. We are. I think, Jody, what you said, like we're in the middle of the Red Sea right now. We haven't created yet the rituals or the language or the the form. We're not even through the trauma, right? We're like there's a midrash, a legend that like the midrash that the Red Sea is like a birth canal. And like we're still being born. Like we don't, whatever this new thing is that we're going to be born into, we don't even know yet. So like a couple of the other panelists, I feel like we're eating all the traditional foods as a way of anchoring and grounding and centering a little bit of traditional for me, and because we just don't know. Like we're still in whatever that symbol will be.
Well, we've hit our hour mark, so I want to thank each of you, Marcella White Campbell, Rabbi J. Michaelson, Rabbi Elie Kaunfer, and Al Rosenberg for being with us. And thanks also to Lisa Lepson for hosting this webinar and planning it and inviting all these great panelists. And thank you to all of you for being part of our Forward family and spending the hour with us. We will be sending you the video of this. I know someone said in the chat that they missed some of it, so you can check it out on the video. It'll also be on YouTube and on our Facebook page. You can get the Forward in your inbox. You'll get a prompt for that, and you'll also get a discount subscription offer if you're not already a subscriber. On Sundays, we send out a newsletter that tells you all about our upcoming events. We have one on this Monday. I'm hosting a conversation about the Israeli elections on Tuesday with my colleague Jacob Kornblue and two guests from Israel, Yossi Klein Halevi, the wonderful author and teacher, and also Tamar Herman of the Israel Democracy Institute. So please come back for that on Monday at 2:00 Eastern. And Chag Sameach, everybody. I hope that you have a healthy and happy and meaningful and storyful and question asking holiday, and that you find meaning in the rituals and connection across the community. So thanks again for being with us. I'm Jody Redoran. This is The Forward.